Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to continue our series of lectures on the civil rights movement. In particular, we're going to talk about a different side of the civil rights movement, and that's Black nationalism. So first of all, we really kind of need to define what Black nationalism or Black liberation theology is essentially all about. And so essentially what Black nationalism is is it's the idea of Black self-empowerment. This, the belief that, white society isn't going to ever fully acculturate African Americans into, American society. And so, it's this idea that Black Americans need to be self-sufficient. They need to be proud of who they are, and the idea of self-sufficiency is kind of key. It means that, white teachers won't give Black students a fair education. So it means Black teachers for Black students in Black schools with Black principals. It means that, Black people should shop at Black businesses that have Black owners that live in Black neighborhoods. And then that way the community's wealth isn't going to, some white business owner that lives in a white neighborhood outside of, your typical like urban city center. It means Black cops for Black neighborhoods. That way you have less racial incidents. And so the idea of Black nationalism is really going to start to grow after 1964. And that should kind of make sense. The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King has been promising everybody, if we can get national civil rights legislation passed and a Voting Rights Act passed, then that will make everything better. And then in 64, we get the Civil Rights Act, so no more discrimination. And no more segregation. And then you get in 65, you get the Voting Rights Act, which, ensures that African Americans get, their political rights. And then things didn't automatically get better. And so all of this kind of frustration that had been growing about this slow amount of change, really in 64 and 65 are going to come to a head. And there's going to be a small portion of the movement. And I want to be clear, it is a very small portion. Most people, most African Americans, most civil rights workers are going to side with Martin Luther King and nonviolent civil disobedience. And this idea that we should live in a post-racial society where we all get along, right? But a minority of that movement will start to become radicalized after 64 and 65, and they're going to push towards Black nationalism, which that's not about unity. That's not about white people and Black people getting along. It's it's a different version of segregation, right? Black people from Black communities, and this idea of self-defense is going to be a big part of this movement. Not, white people at the time are going to view the idea of self-defense as advocated by groups like Nation of Islam or the Black Panthers. They're going to view that as like a threat. It's not meant that way. I'm sure there's some radical elements of every group, but for the most part, it's we're not going to be pushed around anymore. And it makes sense that that's happening in 64 and 65 because after that legislation had passed, that Martin Luther King and others promised was going to make everything better. It not only didn't make it better, but we're going to see race riots erupt over 100 major cities all across the United States, and things aren't necessarily getting better. Right. All of this unrest is pushing primarily younger civil rights workers into more radical ideologies. Right? And so they're looking for an alternative to nonviolent civil disobedience. And they're going to find that in organizations like the Black Panthers. They're going to find that in organizations like the Nation of Islam, and following leaders like, Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X. And so, some members of SNCC, including Stokely Carmichael here, is going to actually choose to follow the Black nationalism path. As a matter of fact, Stokely Carmichael is going to popularize the term Black Power. That's going to freak out a lot of white people. They're Black Power. What's that mean? Like Black Power over us? Which is that's not necessarily what he means. What he means is Black self empowerment. Now he's going to say some pretty radical stuff. I mean, he's going to talk about like I'm not going to be pushed around anymore. I'm going to defend myself. I'm going to have these guns and Black Power. And when he's saying that like I said, that's going to scare a lot of white people. But really, what he's saying is Black empowerment means self empowerment, community empowerment. We can't wait for white people to come around to try and help us. We got to help ourselves, empower our community, and make sure that we're not taken advantage of. And there will later be a term by any means necessary. So, like I said, it's becoming more radical, more militant, and is really kind of changing the way that challenging the way that society is set up. Stokely Carmichael was a freedom rider, right? So he was one of these nonviolent civil disobedience guys at Howard University. But is going to take a different route. And so one of the one of Stokely Carmichael's famous speeches at the March Against Fear is an example of kind of the more provocative rhetoric that's going to be used by the Black nationalists. I'm going to read it to you here. This is the 27th time I've been arrested, and I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we're going to stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. What we got to start saying now is Black Power. Now, when the white community hears that, they're like, what do you mean take over? Can the Black Panthers or any minority group in America at the time actually take over America? No, that's ridiculous. That's not what he's talking about here, even though that is kind of what it sounds like. What he's talking about here is, we have to take over our own communities and control our own communities. And that's what he's trying to push. But when white people hear that, what they're hearing is, oh my God, these radicals are gonna take over the entire country. Now look at what he really is saying. This is the 27th time I've been arrested. That's nonviolent civil disobedience. It's see a wrong, resist it, get arrested, accept it, and then try and draw attention to it. And what he's saying is like, I just can't keep going to jail. Like I'm not going to allow that to happen to me anymore. I'm going to start defending myself, and I'm going to start protecting my community. And so the phrase Black Power becomes a thing that really revolves out of the Marcus Garvey 1920s Black is beautiful concept. It's be proud of who you are, be proud of your culture. You've contributed to society, American society, the world. You should be proud of that and really support that. Now Stokely Carmichael will eventually join the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were created by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But Stokely Carmichael will get really frustrated just with America in general, and he will change his name to Kwame Ture. And again, kind of that idea that Stokely Carmichael, that's my slave name. When my ancestors were brought here, we lost our family names, and we were given these names. And so he throws off Stokely Carmichael, becomes Kwame Ture, and is going to move back to Africa. And so actually leave America and say, because he believes that America just can't ever fully integrate African Americans. So, what's the Black Power movement really about? Well, there's lots of different, there's going to be lots of different leaders of the Black Power movement or Black nationalism. There's going to be lots of degrees of separation between them. They're not all the same. They don't all believe in the same. It's not, this, homogenous kind of group, but there are certain similarities in these groups. Just like Martin Luther King is not the actual leader of the nonviolent civil disobedience movement, he's like the symbolic leader. In the Black Power movement, Malcolm X really becomes the symbolic leader of that movement, even though there's no official overall leader. They do have several kind of universal goals. One of those is the development of Black businesses. Like I said before, they're saying we need to be self-sufficient. We need to spend our money in Black businesses. It's helping other Black people get ahead, and it's keeping the wealth in our community. If the business owner is Black and lives in our neighborhood, that money stays in our neighborhood. But if we spend it at the white store, we spend our money there. That money goes to the white business owner that lives in a different community. He spends the money he made in our community, in the white community, and so they're really gonna be critical of that, and so they're gonna try and promote Black businesses and shopping Black. They're going to talk about, Black control of schools. They believe that white teachers, just are not capable of teaching Black children the same. And so, we need African American teachers for African American students, African American principals for African American students. And that's the only way they believe that Black people will get a fair shot in the education system. Black police officers to limit, racist cops in their neighborhoods, unwanted stops and searches and seizures and things like that. And so if you have a Black cop from that neighborhood policing that neighborhood, then you're going to have fewer conflicts there, is what they believe. And then a Black voting block. And so, we are in a democracy and what they're saying is when Black people go vote, they should vote for other Black people. And then, once we have more Black politicians, we'll start to see, less discrimination and racism in the laws that we get in from our politicians. And then Black pride. Of these list of things that we have here, all the way over there, to one degree or another, I think a lot of the Black community can get on board with some of those things. I don't, but overall, most Black people in America at this time really wanted to, they want to be able to send their kids to the best schools, whether they're white or Black schools. They want to shop where they can get the best deal. They want to help, their fellow African Americans. They might want more Black cops on the police force, but most Americans at the time, don't have this as their vision of what America can be, which is essentially segregation, right? White people over here, Black people over there. Now, the Black nationalists, on the other hand, they're looking around and they're saying, look, we tried to intermingle. And as much as we've intermingled, it hasn't worked out. And so maybe we need to completely separate. And so, in a big part of, I shouldn't say a big part of the movement, but a controversial part of the movement is the use of violence if necessary. Now, this will get, I mean, even today, I think this gets misconstrued a lot. What they're really talking about is defense. Now, there's going to be some radicals, just like in any group, that are going to be, talking about, kill the white devil. But that's not the average civil rights worker, for sure, right? They're nonviolent. And it's not the average Black nationalist. When they're talking about violence if necessary, they're saying we don't want it to be necessary, right? But you can't come in our neighborhoods and police us in a way that we feel is unsafe. You can't come into our neighborhoods and riot in our neighborhoods because you're upset that the local factory hired some Black people. And if you try to do those things, we will defend our homes, we will defend our property, we will defend our families. And so it is the official message is a self-defense message, but unfortunately, that's not the message that the media portrays, and it's not the message that the average, white American hears. So Malcolm X, he's actually born Malcolm Little. His father will be lynched when Malcolm Little is very young, and so that's really going to kind of paint Malcolm's view of America. And so I think what's really interesting is, you've got these two leaders of the civil rights movement that have totally different views. Martin Luther King, nonviolent civil disobedience. Malcolm X, by any means necessary, and whites and blacks can't get along. At least in the beginning of his, time as a black nationalist. And so two totally separate messages and two totally separate, childhoods. Martin Luther King was brought up in a loving house by an educated family, goes to school, it's a, loving two-parent household. Malcolm X grows up with a father who's lynched by racists. Really struggles, doesn't get the best education. Starts out, is poor, and gets in trouble with the law a couple of times, some drug offenses, and whatnot. And so it's weird how the two have these totally different kind of childhoods, and then that leads them as adults to have two completely diverging views how to deal with the civil rights movement. The psychoanalysts will say what they will, but I do think it's interesting. So Malcolm X is Malcolm Little. He will spend time in jail for selling drugs and burglary. And it's when he's in jail that he runs into members of the Nation of Islam. And so this is a black nationalist Muslim group that really is, preaching black nationalism, and takes this time and kicks drugs and gets rid of that, gets that out of his life. The black nationalists are very much anti-drugs, and the Nation of Islam, I should say, is very much anti-drugs, and uses his time to really kind of study Islam and black nationalism, and will emerge from prison as a spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. And so he's not the leader. The leader is the Honorable Prophet Elijah Muhammad, and so that guy is the guy that's in charge. But Malcolm X very quickly becomes the mouthpiece for the movement, because he is such just an extremely good speech maker. And so, he enters back into the community, advocating for Black pride, economic self reliance, identity politics, right? Black people should vote for Black politicians. And, very quickly is, going to be this national figure. And so, a lot of Black people will, find him very appealing, because they're tired of nonviolent civil disobedience. They're tired of being pushed around, and they'll kind of flock to Malcolm X. Now, interestingly enough, Malcolm X will eventually have a falling out with the Nation of Islam. The Honorable Prophet Elijah Muhammad isn't really living up to the religious standards of the Muslim religion. And Malcolm X really kind of has a problem with that. And so what he does is he, during the height of the movement, when he's advocating all this Black nationalism and saying, white people just aren't going to give Black people an opportunity, but he's struggling with his own leadership within his group, he decides to take a religious pilgrimage called the Hajj. And so when he takes this pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia, and so, all faithful Muslims that are physically healthy and can afford it are supposed to go on this pilgrimage. And when he does that, what he realizes is that there are, Islam is a diverse religion. There's all kinds of, billion Muslims on the planet. And so when he goes to Saudi Arabia for this pilgrimage, he sees Arab Muslims and white Muslims and Black Muslims all working together and acting as brothers, and actually comes back to America and starts to soften his tone. he's going to start to say like, look, we still have to advocate for Black people and Black empowerment, self-reliance is still important. But he says there are some white people that we can work with. Not all white people are the devil. And, I'm willing to work with anybody who truly does want to see an America that is, strongly advocates for Black people. Because of that, Malcolm X will end up being assassinated. He's going to leave the Nation of Islam. The leadership at the top, they're drinking. There's infidelity there, and so he's just like, I'm going to cut ties from the Nation of Islam. When that happens, he will be assassinated by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. I know Netflix just came out with a documentary that questions whether or not it was the Nation of Islam that killed Malcolm X. I haven't seen the documentary, but there's substantial evidence that the Nation of Islam actually did order the assassination of Malcolm X. And so Malcolm X will be assassinated essentially, right after he starts to kind of soften his tone a little bit, and saying, there are some white people out there we can, that we as a people can work with. And so, I think a lot of people have forgotten that because of some of his more, kind of radical rhetoric. By the way, he was Malcolm Little. He changed his name to Malcolm X when he converted to Islam. And again, the X is just symbolic of, I don't know my last name. And so, that's the thing that a lot of African Americans that are descendants of slaves, they don't really know their traditional family's last names, because when they were brought to America as slaves, they were given a new last name. And so X just represents the name that he doesn't know. So, Malcolm X gets assassinated just as he softens up his tone. But what he is most remembered for is the ballot or the bullet speech. And I'll read a part of it to you here. I'll post this video later that's got a link to, some speeches that he gives. So if you want to check that out, you can check it out on my website. But the ballot or the bullet speech, it'll be the ballot or it'll be the bullet. It'll be liberty or it'll be death. And if you're not ready to pay that price, don't use the word freedom in your vocabulary. Now, again, this is going to scare all kinds of white people. They're like, the ballot or the bullet? And then, you tend to focus on the bullet. Like, what are you saying here? You want an armed uprising of African Americans in the United States? Like, I mean, that would be awful. And so it's really going to scare a lot of, a lot of people. Now, is that what he's actually saying? No, right? It'll be the ballot or it'll be the bullet. So what's that mean? Well, it means we got to have change, right? And there's 2 ways to do it: the ballot or the bullet. And the way the speech is structured, it's pretty clear here. It'll be the ballot or it'll be the bullet, which implies we want to do it through the ballot. Like we want to, go out and vote, and we want to have, other people vote with us for real change that's going to make life better for African Americans. But if you don't do it, we'll get it done by any means necessary, and that includes the bullet, right? And if you're not willing, and what he's telling to Black people, because remember, there's a divide in the movement. The majority of African Americans on the nonviolent civil disobedience side, and he's telling them, and if you're not ready to pay that price, don't use the word freedom in your vocabulary. He says you don't understand freedom if you're not willing to make that sacrifice. And so, really calling him out there. So that's really what he gets remembered for, even though after he comes back from Mecca in Saudi Arabia, he softens that up a little bit. Now, I got to point out here as a historian, Martin Luther King's approach was definitely more what's the word I want to hear? Definitely more effective. There's no doubt about it. In a democracy, generally speaking, when your side becomes violent, the average American just won't tolerate that, and they're not going to support you, and you're not going to get the things, the legislation you want passed to enact the change that you actually want. And so, that's the genius of Martin Luther King. Right. But that's not to say that Black nationalism didn't significantly contribute to the movement, and it did, because it brought up this. Martin Luther King was like, we'll all get together and we'll all get along, and black kids in white schools, white kids in black schools, and that's great, and that is awesome. But there is also something to be said for self-sustaining communities and shopping local. We talk about shopping local today all the time, and keeping the money in your community, and Black nationalism really was just one of the first major nationwide organizations to really kind of point that out. Like, we need to be conscious of where we spend our money, and maybe it would be good to vote for people who look like us, and maybe it would be good if we have more Black teachers, and we should definitely promote Black pride. That's like just like the movement in the 1920s. Like, most people didn't agree with Marcus Garvey and moving back to Africa, but they did like to hear Black is beautiful, and that you should be proud of your culture and your heritage and whatnot. And so, Malcolm X and Black nationalists, they're going to help contribute to that. Right. So next group that we're going to talk about is going to be the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers will kind of be the height of the extremism in the movement. Now, I want to be careful with how you interpret that, because it is one of the more extreme groups. That doesn't mean that they're extremists like we use that word today, right? Because we attach it to terrorism and things like that today when we say extremists. No, we mean the height of Black extremism in the literal definition of extreme, which means that it's the most radical of what's out there. And so the Black Panthers are, and this is why we consider them to be more extreme, because they are a paramilitary group. You can see in the photos here, they dress in a militaristic style. They will advocate for self-defense and rifle clubs, and they'll use rhetoric about fascist pig cops and so there are elements of it that get really extreme. Now, the day-to-day functions of the Black Panthers are going to be much different. The day-to-day functions of Black Panthers are going to be, school lunches and building playgrounds and healthcare centers, and again, in Black communities, because it's all about empowering the community. So, right now, the idea is that they will be a forceful organization that, if the police don't clean up the police forces, then they'll police their own neighborhoods with rifle clubs, which are essentially like neighborhood watch groups, but are armed. And they're going to use the, those rifle clubs in a way that is slightly intimidating to try to push through their agenda. Now, they're not going to advocate going into white neighborhoods and killing white people. They're not going to advocate for those types of things. It is done through the lens of self-defense, right? But it's a step further than that. Like, these are neighborhoods, we're going to protect them, and we're gonna do it ourselves, and we might not necessarily wait for there to be a problem. And so the Black Panthers as an organization, because of the way they look and because of the rhetoric that they use, fascist pig cops and things like that, they get painted in the media as this extremely radical group, but that's really a small part of what the Black Panthers are. History has kind of forgotten, because of the way that they had gotten portrayed in the media back then and the way they get portrayed in the movies today, that they're really a community group. And it's a community group that has a violent side. There's no doubt about that. But their main function is a community group. And so, they're going to build playgrounds and medical centers. They're going to provide backpacks for kids to get to school. They're neighborhood watch groups to try and limit the amount of crime in neighborhoods. And their biggest legacy, and the thing that most people don't credit them for, but is true, is they started school breakfast programs. And so, the two big centers, because the Black Panthers were really a small group. Their epicenters were in the LA area, in California and Chicago, and so they're like kind of an inner city group. Tend to be younger African Americans, both male and female, and they recognized that a lot of African American kids were going to school hungry because they were living in impoverished inner city communities, and so they set up free school breakfast programs. Well, that free school breakfast program was so successful that the public education systems in California and Illinois saw it and were like, "Ooh, maybe we should attempt something like that today." And so if your kid or a neighbor or some kid is getting a free breakfast at school, the Black Panthers really started that trend. I mean, we can give them credit for that. And so I think that's a really important function. And so the Black Panthers are going to push that stuff through. They're going to push through Black Pride, and so they're going to, talk about, you don't have to dress like white people. They're going to dress, primarily in black. They're going to talk about, you don't have to try and make your hair look like white people hair, and so you're going to start to see a more naturalistic hairstyle from the Black Panthers and Black nationalists in general. And so, and this idea that like light skinned African Americans aren't more beautiful than dark skinned African Americans. That's been a thing in America since the beginnings of slavery. And so, they're going to steal that from Marcus Garvey, which is essentially no, it's like, light skin, dark skin, whatever. You're all beautiful. Be proud of who you are, be proud of your culture. And so they're really going to push for that. They've got four basic desires, the Black Panthers, that they want to be able to accomplish. It's equality in education, right? So they want better schools for Black kids. They want equality in housing. Housing is a huge thing. Inner city housing is it's not up to par. They want access to better housing and cheaper housing, equality in employment, and better civil rights legislation. And so those are the things that they're going to be pushing through. Now, like I said, this is why the Black Panthers are pegged as being this extremist group. And look, I mean, as far as a political, I mean, this is pretty extreme. Excuse me. And so we can see here Black Panther Party, two Black Panthers standing out front, dressed in paramilitary style, which is like pseudo military with the berets. They are armed, and which at the time is kind of scary. And then at the bottom here, I'm gonna move the magic, move my video here. All right, and then the bottom down here, the poster reads, "The racist dog policemen must withdraw immediately from our communities, cease their wanton murder and brutality and torture of Black people, or face the wrath of the armed people." Right? That's pretty rough. Now, there's racist cops. Sure, there's racist cops today. There were more racist cops back then. There's no doubt about it. Now, are all cops racist dogs that are torturing, murdering, and killing Black people? Clearly, that's not the case. And so, this will lead to an antagonization between the Black Panther Party and the police, and it's going to kind of draw a line in the sand. And so, for most of white America, they're looking at it as either your pro Black Panther Party or your pro police. And that, as far as white people are concerned, that's going to be scary. And so and again, and you might ask, well, why is it important what white people think? Well, you got to remember, from a political perspective, the vast majority of America is white, and we live in a democracy. And so, if you alienate the majority of white people, how likely is it that you're going to get laws passed that are going to give you equal education or equal housing or equal employment or better civil rights legislation. I mean, it's probably not going to happen, and so you know it's what it is. And again, these types of things, this rhetoric and these images, it is a part of the Black Panther movement. It is a part of the Black Panthers in general, but it's not the day-to-day function of the Black Panthers. This is what history tends to remember, right? And these images is what history tends to remember. But they don't tend to remember, the hundreds of health clinics that get built and the hundreds of playgrounds that get built and the free school breakfasts and lunches that get created and those things. And so, I don't want to downplay the extremism that's there, but I definitely think it's important that we talk about the positive things that come out of the Black Panther movement as well. Move my little thing back here. All right. So again, the Black nationalist movement will spread, further than just the Nation of Islam or Black Panthers. There's going to be, athletes that are going to, really kind of take a look at this movement, and artists, and are going to be stealing parts of it. Two of those people are John Carlos and Tommie Smith, and so this is the 1968 Olympics. And so the African Americans have been competing for America in the Olympics for a while, and it's going to be Tommie Smith and John Carlos that are going to use their wins, first and third place wins, as an opportunity to protest. And so this is one of the more famous protests. As a matter of fact, today, when you're talking about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem, that is really derivative of what Tommie Smith and John Carlos did at the Olympics. And what they're essentially protesting is the treatment of African Americans in America. And they're doing it on the world stage, trying to draw attention to a topic to create change. And so this is, whether you agree with it or not, just like Colin Kaepernick, this is part of being in a democracy, right? If you see something in society that you think needs to be changed, it's your obligation to go out and change it. I mean, that's what democracy is about. It's an obligation that we have as a citizen. Now, this is going to be, insulting to a lot of Americans, because they think that the Olympics, just like the national anthem today, and at sporting events, are supposed to be a time where we're unified and we come together. But just like Martin Luther King said in his letter from a Birmingham jail, like, well, before you tell me not to do something like this, stop and think about what my life is like, and how much I've had to endure as a citizen, as a person, and before you judge me. And so Tommie Smith and John Carlos, famously, while the American flag is being raised and they're playing the national anthem, they are going to put their hands up in protest instead of having their hands over their heart. So the right hand here, so you see Tommie Smith with his right hand up, that is meant to represent Black power. You see that that John Carlos has his left hand up. That is meant to recognize Black unity, symbolize Black unity. And both of them are not wearing their shoes, which is designed to represent Black poverty. And it really is, in 1968, going to create a big stir and get people talking about the civil rights movement. It's going to, like I said before, it's going to turn off a lot of like average Midwestern Americans. They're going to view it as disrespectful to the flag and to the country. But a lot of young African Americans are going to look at it and they're going to say, finally, somebody's speaking up about this on a huge stage where the entire world is watching. And they're going to be very appreciative of their message getting out there. And that's the thing about democracy, right? When we have freedom of speech, the only time freedom of speech is never important when we all agree, right? I mean, even in dictatorships, they allow speech that everybody agrees with, as long as the dictator agrees with it. Free speech is only important when people are saying something that you disagree with, right? That's the speech that needs to be protected the most. And so, today I see as a teacher, you look on college campuses today, and they're shutting down speech, and there's speakers that come in that say something that's maybe controversial, and they're running them off of campus, and they're saying, "How dare you say something offensive?" I mean, that to me as an educator, that's abhorrent, because if you can shut down their speech, you can shut down Tommy Smith's speech and John Carlos's speech, and or Colin Kaepernick's speech, and right. And so, if you want to protect Colin Kaepernick's ability to take a knee, you got to protect the right of some conservative on a university campus giving an opinion that maybe you don't like. And so, I think that's something that Tommy Smith, John Carlos, Colin Kaepernick really should be teaching all of us, is that that this is democracy, this is how it works, and we're not always going to agree with it, and but it's important that we respect everybody's right to voice their opinion. So that will conclude today's lecture on kind of the other part of the civil rights movement. Just a couple things I want you to keep in mind. Black nationalism is really about empowerment in the African American community. There is an element of self-defense to it, so it is not nonviolent civil disobedience, but it's not outright violent, right? They're not out there advocating for outright violence. It is more self-defense, even though the media is going to play it up as a violent movement. The other thing is that the vast majority of African Americans during that time period and today still are believers in democracy and nonviolent civil disobedience, and Martin Luther King's approach that eventually Americans are going to be able to racially intermingle, and that like Martin Luther King says, one day he hopes his daughter will be judged by the content of her character and not the color of her skin. And I think because most African Americans did side with Martin Luther King, every day we're a step closer to that. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But not to say that Black nationalism didn't contribute all kinds of great things, which is African American pride, community empowerment, and things of that nature. All right, thank you very much, and I will see you again shortly.